I don't know about you, but I love a car that tells a story, and the mk5 Escort, which was launched in 1990, tells one of the most interesting stories in automotive history. It usually goes like this. Launched in 1990, it was derided by the press, hastily facelifted in 1992 and again in 1995, and then finally replaced by the all-conquering Ford Focus in 1998. Is the story really that simple? And is the mk5 Escort really that dreadful? Grab a cup of tea or coffee and come with me and find out. Let's go back to 1980, and the front-wheel drive Mark III Escort was a big leap forward from the car which preceded it. Remember that the Mark II was only a skin-deep facelift of the 1968 original, and ran with a rear-wheel drive platform and a simple rear leaf spring suspension. It was coarse but well loved, but highly outdated by the 1980s. The new Mark III Escort was a direct competitor to things like the Golf and the Opel Kadett, and was very favourably received, and in fact won the European Car of the Year in 1981. The Mark IV Escort of 1986 was a fairly mild facelift of the Mark III to keep the model fresh. But by about 1985, Ford were hard at work on the next full generation for the 1990s. One of the major problems that this project, codenamed CE14, suffered was called the Ford Sierra. The Sierra launched in 1982 to a world which was not ready yet for its radical aerodynamic jelly mould styling, nor ready for Ford's bestseller to be only sold as a hatchback when conservative Cortina buyers loved its saloon body. Ford were forced to make extensive Sierra revisions and indeed engineer a saloon model, the Sapphire, launched in 1987. The Sierra project not only took away the confidence to do something daring and bold, but the unexpected redesign took a lot more of Ford's design budget than an already launched car should. So when the CE14 project got going, it was tasked with coming up with a new car that wouldn't risk frightening away the buyers of the current Escort, and also one which might be cheaper to build than the previous generation. So the Mark V became a gentle evolution of the Mark IV and not a revolution. You can see that in the outline. From a distance, they share broadly the same silhouette with 4 window pillars and a bustle tail, and you can see it even more so in the fascia, which takes the Mark IV's layout and softens the edges a little. Cost cutting became another major factor for the Mark V. Any improvement that was made to it was designed to make the car cheaper and easier to build for Ford, rather than better for you as the owner or driver. 2 examples of these include changing the rear suspension to a simple torsion beam arrangement as opposed to the independent suspension that was in the Mark III and IV, and also these vacuum form seats, which I will talk to you a little bit more about. The way they're constructed is really interesting. So there is a layer of fabric which is glued to a layer of plastic backing. That's then placed on a machine which has 15 placements for the shape of the seats. A big lid comes down on it, a little bit like a giant waffle maker, and then into each of those sections the foam as a liquid form is pumped into, and the vacuum then sucks it and forms it into the correct shape of the seats. Crucially, that means that 2 unskilled people can form 15 seats in 90 seconds, cutting out the need for seamstresses, people to make metal clips and tacks and that sort of thing inside the seats, really reducing production costs. The motoring press, of course, were not very keen on these seats from launch and criticised them for being very flat and unpleasant to use, but I actually disagree. The bottom sort of lump on the seat acts a bit like a lumbar support and fits right into the small of my back, making me feel really nice and supported. It also has really good thigh support, good shoulder support. I really quite like them. The only place they fall down is when cornering. They're a bit flat. They don't have too much sort of lateral support, but you don't briskly corner in a Mark V Escort. The main flaw with the seats, of course, comes a little bit later on, which is why they didn't catch on. The fabric detaches from the plastic backing and so kind of ends up sagging and making the interior of the car look really, really untidy and unpleasant. Back to the main story. The Mark V Escort launched in 1990 in October to a lukewarm reception from the motoring press. There was heavy criticism from certain corners, particularly Autocar, which pitted it against the Tipo, the Mark II Golf and the Mark II Astra, concluding the new Escort to lose out to each of them. However, when I read the articles, it isn't entirely clear to me that the substance of each test actually deserves that conclusion. The Escort isn't necessarily bad according to what they say, it just perhaps lacks a certain flair that the others demonstrate in particular ways. As a car in and of itself, it scores quite well on almost every criteria, but doesn't seem to inspire or excite the journalists, and I think that really is the result of a car being designed by clinicking customers rather than design flair. Jeremy Clarkson tested the Escort for Top Gear in 1990, and the main takeaway point that most people give from that is that he thought it was dreadful. But that's actually not the case if you listen to it, what he's saying properly, or read the article he wrote at the same time in a newspaper. You'll see he's actually quite balanced, and he praises the car's improvements over the previous generation, but he does level, rightly, criticisms at the harshness of the CVH engines, and also the arm twirling of the steering, which has quite a lot of range lock to lock. Personally, I actually quite like that because I think it makes the car really light to steer around town, but I do see his point. Perhaps when you're kind of going into quite sharp bends and that kind of thing, you do have to turn your hands a little bit more than in other cars. I've got a book here of press cuttings from the Mark V's launch, and almost universally the car is praised for its sort of no-nonsense and unfussy approach to motoring, something that actually appealed to a lot of ordinary motorists and Ford buyers in particular. Remember the love I mentioned there was for the outdated old Mark II Escort and the hatred of the futuristic Sierra? The Mark V Escort was frankly just what Ford needed at the time. Add also the fact that the car featured high on the best-selling list of cars in the UK for most of the 1990s, and you might have to concede that the Escort perhaps isn't as bad as the headlines suggested it was. Why then is the Mark V thought of now with such derision? My view is that it was a product of bad timing in a way. There's the Sierra issue, which caused a cash problem and a retreat from bold design. But then there's the Mark III Fiesta, which was always considered a success. Driving them side by side, the Mark III Fiesta and the Mark V Escort share an awful lot of similarities, yet those criticisms were not laid at its feet in 1989. Perhaps that the Fiesta was a success is what harmed the Escort. The Mark III Fiesta was a major step up from the Mark II that came before it, in exactly the way the Mark III Escort brought its predecessor up to date. It was a success story in a new model being markedly better than the one before, exceeding the standards of the competition that was about at the time and upsetting nobody. Perhaps expectations were therefore high when the Escort came out, yet that was merely an evolution of the previous perfectly decent car. Ford hadn't tried hard enough. It was dull, unsexy, and above all looked outdated and frumpy compared to its competitors. The rest of the story is of course a hasty facelift in 1992, brought the styling more into line with the Mondeo of the following year, and softened the Escort's more awkward lines, particularly at the boot lid. It also finally gained a new range of smooth modern engines, now known as the Z-Tech family. Then again a bigger facelift in 1995 with a wholly revised interior where those vacuum-formed seats were ditched. But the Escort story doesn't end there. The very fact that 1998's Focus came to replace it seems to cast a doubly negative shadow on the Escort. The trope goes that the Mark V Escort was so dull that the Focus would not have come about had the Escort not been so rubbish. Is that really true? The Mondeo was the first Ford to launch with true driver appeal and with a target of becoming a class leader, and development of that was far underway before any Mark V Escort ever met the metal presses. It was already a path Ford were taking, regardless of the reception of the Escort. The Cat, with its sharp and bold new edge styling, came along in 1996 and would have begun development at about the same time as the Escort was launched. It's a very easy trope to make, but the reality is perhaps a little more nuanced. And that therefore brings me to the Focus of 1998. It's a very good car, everybody says so. This is my Focus and I really enjoy driving it. I do think it's a very good car. But, and this is where you're going to fall out with me and start writing awful things in the comments that I know nothing, and I am sorry about that. I actually prefer driving the Escort. I actually said it. I've actually said that on YouTube. My career's going to be over, I tell you, already. Why do I think this? The Focus handles brilliantly, there's no denying that. I drove it on some Welsh country roads, even with knackered rear suspension, and it was poised and eager and planted. But the trade-off for that is it drives a bit like a sports car. The gear change is satisfyingly stiff with zero slack. The power steering is weighty to keep you in a straight line on motorways, but easy to throw into corners on country roads. There's also a lot more metal, with a high window line which consequently gives you less visibility and makes the interior darker. Those aren't bad things necessarily, of course, and we've come to expect those characteristics in all our cars since the time of the Focus. Step back into the driving seat of the Escort, and we suddenly have a light and airy cabin, an unfussy and uncluttered dashboard, a light and delicate gear change, easy and precise steering, all demanding a lightness of touch that's both more direct because of the analogue nature of it, and yet less direct because of the reduction in effort. I'm not saying that these characteristics of the Escort are better per se, but what they do in 2024 is to make it feel a more special place to be. It harks back to a simpler time, a time when cars were lighter in weight and in cabin, and a time when cars sold well because they were competent and unfussy, and not because they wore the correct badge. So for me, the Mark V Escort is actually a very important and interesting car. Whether you think it's dreadful or not, it holds its own as an underdog car with a story to tell, and doesn't deserve simply to be dismissed as irrelevant in the classic car world of today. This particular one is even more special, being the earliest surviving car, as far as I'm aware, in base form, which means that it's probably the purest Mark V Escort you will ever come across. And having just driven it 600 miles to North Wales and back, I can attest that even at 34 years old, it still serves its owner faithfully and with a minimum of fuss. All that remains for me to say is thank you very much indeed for watching this slightly different style of video to usual, but I thought it was important to tell the Mark V Escort story. Join me in the next video when I will be doing a proper solid comparison video between the Escort and the Focus. That is going to be the comparison of the decade. The 1990s, just in case you weren't sure which. See you soon. Bye.